I call Kevin Brennan to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowborn, and good morning. It's always, as always, a pleasure to see you there in the chair, and I beg to move that this House has considered government support. Has considered remuneration for songwriters and composers, perhaps even some government support as well. I should at the outset declare that I am a member of the Ivors Academy and PRS for Music and the Musicians Union and chair the APPG on music. Last night, Mr. Hollowborn, was quite special because some of us, including the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, were invited to Abbey Road Studios in St John's Wood for an event in the famous Studio 2 where the Beatles recorded, most of their recorded material that's ever been released, the vast majority of it. And we were also treated to a wonderful performance by a young singer called Olivia Dean, who's also a songwriter, who performed her song The Hardest Part quite beautifully for us, and I predict big things for her in the next 12 months or so, Mr. Hollowborn. But it was a reminder, really, of the wonderful talent that we have for songwriting and composing in this country, and the great legacy that we have in this country from songwriting and composing. I was fortunate recently to help host the Ivors Academy's Composers Week here in the House of Commons, where a number of composers came along to celebrate great British achievement in composing. Really, when we think about it, that great legacy, it's also a live legacy with young performers like Olivia Dean, but also in Abbey Road itself, not just the Beatles, it was Pink Floyd, it was many, many other great artists, and more recently people like Stormzy and Adele and Ed Sheeran. But behind often some of those great performers who are also songwriters are professional songwriters as well. In the case of Ed Sheeran, a woman who lives quite close to my constituency in South Wales, Amy Wadge, who's behind some of Ed Sheeran's biggest hits, co-writing with him. So we should remember it isn't just the artists, it's also the songwriters and the composers. And I would say, having visited Abbey Road, last night, it did also remind me that we should be protecting the legacy of our great recording studios, including the Maida Vale studios, which the BBC are now selling off, and which there is an opportunity to keep as a going concern as a recording studio. And I think it would be a loss to this country if that were to be sold off for flats rather than maintained as a recording studio. But I want to talk about three things to do with writers, songwriters and composers this morning, and give the Minister an opportunity, obviously, to respond to it. First of all, about the Select Committee's report, which was undertaken, groundbreaking report on the economics of music streaming, which contained a series of recommendations in relation to songwriters and composers as well as to performers, and which I know the Minister has taken a close interest in, particularly in relation to some of the work going on in the Intellectual Property Office. And I'm glad to see him back in his role. We did discuss a lot of these matters when I introduced my private member's bill into the House of Commons at the end of, a year ago now, and the Minister made a number of commitments at that stage, which perhaps he might be able to revisit a little bit in his response to the debate today. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is that, and particularly in relation to streaming. Secondly, I'm going to talk about composer buyouts and the growing problem that presents to our songwriters and composers, and the threat it is to the pipeline for the future of songwriters and composers. And when I've mentioned my third point, I'll give way to the honourable gentleman. And the third point I'm going to talk about, just to give a heads up to the Minister, is about artificial intelligence and the implications of data mining of musical works. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman briefly.
He's a dear friend of mine and dear friend of many. We like his wit in the back seats of the chamber. I refer to that. We'll probably get some of his wit today at PMQs, I suspect. But can I say what a passion and delight that it is to hear him on the subject that means so much to him. But does the honourable gentleman agree that the unfair disadvantage for the songwriters and composers who have made their breakthrough through a viral song on a social media streaming platform only to receive a minimal payment must be addressed by government? The industry has had more than enough time to fix this, and they have refused to do so. So I believe clearly that there's a legislative requirement. The broken record simply won't be fixed.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I do agree with him, and I know he's a bit of a musician himself, and so I completely agree with what he says. Now, you know, I'm not going to go into great lengthy detail about that issue this morning, but suffice to say that the recent Competition and Markets Authority report into the competition issues in the music industry, and in particular into the cross-ownership of both publishing and recording rights of the major record companies, didn't decide to proceed to a full market investigation, but in a way threw the ball a little bit back to the government when they said, first of all, they said, it's not to say we think the market gets a clean bill of health or cannot be improved further. That's a quote from the Competition and Markets Authority, and went on to say, and again I quote, we think it's a matter for the government and policymakers to determine whether the current split of streaming royalties is appropriate and fair, and to explore whether wider policy interventions are required. For example, those relating to the copyright framework and how music streaming licensing rates are set. So the CMA did throw that ball back to the government, and I note that in places like France, quite recently, there's been a successful introduction of, to use the technical term, a form of equitable remuneration, a guaranteed payment when music is streamed, which has been introduced in France. And I also note that the research into equitable remuneration from the Intellectual Property Office research programme is over 3 months late already. So I wonder if the Minister can, I suppose, update us on what's happening in those groups that were set up in the Intellectual Property Office, what's happening in relation to the research, and if he as a Minister, and I put this to the Secretary of State for DCMS yesterday at the Select Committee, if he as a Minister could take a closer interest, there has been some turmoil, I recognise that, and changes around in government since we discussed this a year ago, but if he as a Minister could, you know, put some ministerial input into driving that work further forward and bringing it to a conclusion, because I know he had hoped that that would have been done by last September when we discussed this a year ago, and for a number of reasons, not entirely his fault, and also because the work is complex, I recognise that, that work is still incomplete many months later. So I think some ministerial input is what I'm calling for this morning. You know, the preference was, when we discussed this a year ago, that the industry should come to an agreement. That's what they've done in France about improving remuneration for songwriters and for performers. But if they didn't, then the government was prepared to consider action. So I'd remind him of that and ask him to respond today as to where he stands now and where the government stands on it. And the CMA, as I've said, did conclude that it doesn't have the power to determine whether the current split is appropriate and fair. Now, I note that in the United States, where they do things differently, they have a copyright court that determines these things. The judge described some of the assumptions that the Competition and Markets Authority have made about how difficult it is, what problems might be caused if you change the split, and that it might disadvantage songwriters or it might disadvantage other artists. Described them as heroic assumptions that were being made. So I was surprised to see that in the CMA report. But if it doesn't have the power to do it, and that it's a policy issue for the government to resolve, I would ask the Minister, what avenues is the government pursuing and exploring in order to further resolve this issue? So that's the first point I wanted to mention. The second point I wanted to mention is the issue of buyouts. Now, Parliament has determined, and over many, many decades, that songwriters and composers should be entitled to a royalty when their work is performed or when it's recorded. And it did so because it recognises that the Creative Act involves the creation of intellectual property. And that is extremely important, and that is, many people don't understand, a key source of income to songwriters and composers. In recent years, the practice, there's nothing new in this, it's happened throughout history, Mr. Hollowbone, to an extent that everybody's want to get their hands on the composers and songwriters' money and get a piece of the pie, whether it's Colonel Tom Parker with Elvis Presley or whoever. But in recent years, a particularly pernicious practice has grown up, particularly with some media companies, of demanding up front, when they commission a piece of music, perhaps for a TV series or perhaps for a film, that the composer and songwriter signs a contract that waives away their right to their royalties, which they have a right to for their lifetime and beyond, in fact. And that was Parliament's intention, that that should be the case. Now, you might say, Mr. Hollowbone, well, that's their choice. They don't have to sign the contract. A contract is something that's entered into equally between two parties. But the power dynamic here is completely weighed towards the powerful media companies when they do that, because composers know that they'll end up on a blacklist of some sort if they don't agree to sign away some or all of their rights. And often composers have been prepared to do some of that, but it's becoming more and more the case now that they've been asked to completely give up their rights to their royalties when they are commissioned. And I have had some composers who got in touch with me ahead of this debate, describing the practices of one particular media company called Moonbug, that when it commissions works from composers, demands that they give up 100% of their royalties. So I think the government, might say, well, this is a private matter, it's a contractual matter, but I do think there is room for leadership from government to support a code of conduct in the industry to make sure that media companies are not routinely able to get away with this practice, which, as I say, is a pernicious practice and is one that's becoming more and more common. And the third thing I want to talk about briefly, Mr. Hollowbone, in the rest of the time I have available, is about artificial intelligence and the threat that potentially exists to our songwriters and composers from a decision that the government announced earlier in the year, but which I understand it's now reviewing. Now, the Minister knows we've spoken about this privately previously, and I've expressed my concerns, and I know other members across the House have also expressed their concerns, as have stakeholders from the music industry. I will give way. Yeah.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way, and I congratulate him on this superb debate, which is very important, and his superb leadership of the APPG on Music as chair. Does my honourable friend agree that the proposed TDM exception to promote AI would remove the need for a licence to reproduce copies of original works, and so remove any opportunity for performers or creators to be remunerated for their talent and work? And furthermore, because there's not an opt-out for performers and creatives, that would have a severe detrimental effect on their creative personality, because in future it'll be done by a computer.
Well, my honourable friend has sort of made part of my speech for me in her intervention, so I thank her for that, because it does emphasise the point I wished to make. And just to be clear what this is, Mr. Hollowbone, it means that if the government's original position on this were to be maintained, that any tech company could freely data mine creative output, including what we're discussing this morning, musical works, in order to produce, using artificial intelligence, a kind of facsimile of that music, not an exact copy necessarily, but a sort of facsimile, if you like, of that music, in order to commercially exploit that sort of facsimile, without any ability for the composer to give permission for that, or to license, or for rights holders to license that. And it did seem to me a very strange thing for a conservative government to be, trampling all over property rights in this way. And I hope that it was a decision perhaps that was taken in some of the turmoil that's been going on recently in government, and one that it will now actively reconsider. Now, I spoke to the Secretary of State for DCMS yesterday at the Select Committee about this, and she indicated that this matter is under review. I did press her on what direction of travel the government were likely to take, and whether it would be back towards, yes, allowing reasonable exemptions perhaps for academic purposes, as long as it really is for that reason and is negotiated properly with rights holders and with the industry, but not allowing just free access for people to exploit other people's work and, in a sense, be able to pickpocket them of their intellectual property and then reproduce it in a slightly different format using artificial intelligence. Because the implications of that for songwriters and composers and their ability to make a living is quite considerable into the future. So I hope the Minister, in responding, can tell us a bit more about that review, about why the government came to that conclusion originally, but confirm that this isn't... I understand why he might want to promote tech. We all want to see innovation and so on using technology, but it can't be done, at the expense of people's creative rights and at the expense of their intellectual property. So I like the Minister when he responds perhaps to tell us a bit more about the timeline for that review and who he's listening to on this subject and perhaps a little lean into what the direction of travel is. Thank you.